For private use, right? As long as it's for private use of it, not
Yeah,
you're
it's
going to
just
post
a
it publicly.
few members that are not
Uh,
here tonight.
no problem. Yep. All right, so let me start a share. See if I can desktop entire screen.
Click on the share button.
Yeah, I'm
You open your PowerPoint and then
I might have to quit and come back. Give me 1 second.
You're too young to have problems like this.
I know. As one reason I like history is it is a time before all these technological sort of dependencies.
it's a good comment, Tim.
Give me 1 second. I may have to, I got a message suggesting I would maybe have to quit and come back over it. So let me just try this one
Okay,
more
that's all right.
and see if
That'll give us time for some of us to read the book.
Yeah, I'll come back in 2 weeks. How about that? So can you see it now? Can everyone see
Yeah, we
Yes.
can.
Okay, great. So let me go. I'm now in PowerPoint. I'm gonna make this the full screen.
Perfect. Yeah.
And I think it should be slideshow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm gonna start a timer here so I know when we should wrap up and get to questions. Thank you for having me again. It's always nice to talk about this book that I spent 4 years of my life on, and at times it was long days and hard work, but overall this is a really fascinating topic and a really enlightening project that gave a lot of meaning to me, and I hope I can convey some of it to you right now. Essentially, this is a tale of two tales. It's really about these North Pole explorers, and perhaps a little more relevantly to today, it is a tale of rival newspapers and the role of the press in this particular sort of period and in this particular North Pole controversy, which happened in 1909. And honestly, this controversy, nothing like it had ever been seen before in the world of exploring. And in my opinion, nothing has really been seen since. We've had many controversies, of course, but nothing coming out of the exploring world quite like this. And that controversy sheds light, in my opinion, on the American political, cultural world of that period and also of today. I think there are certain through lines in the way we consume news, take sides, relate to politics and charismatic public figures and things like that. So without further ado, the story starts with this controversy in September 1909. The American explorer Frederick Cook sends a cablegram back to New York City and to the world, and he sends that cablegram from the Shetland Islands in northern Scotland in the North Atlantic, and the cablegram in that he claims to have reached the North Pole in 1908, the year before. This is huge news. You know, this North Pole is something people have been trying to discover, to get to for decades. And so this story bounces around the world. This is headline news. And it's especially big news in a very powerful newspaper of the period called the New York Herald. The Herald is not around anymore. Some of you may remember the Herald Tribune, which was in existence until the 1960s. The Herald Tribune was sort of a descendant of the New York Herald. At the time, though, this was 1909, Herald is a very powerful, influential paper. Frederick Cook, importantly, offers the exclusive rights to his North Pole story to the New York Herald. And so this creates an alliance, really, between the Herald and Frederick Cook. They're kind of both in this together. The Herald has invested a great deal of money, and Frederick Cook is going to rely on this paper to sort of tell his side of the story. The great thing about this return of Frederick Cook in 1909, he comes into Copenhagen, and many thousands of people come to the harbor to greet him, the sort of victorious explorer. And among those are several people with movie cameras. So we actually have footage of Frederick Cook returning to Copenhagen. He is the most famous man in the world at this moment because he has reached the North Pole and surprised everyone. he's not that well known an explorer, but he certainly is after this bombshell news story breaks. Here he is being greeted by the Danish crown prince, Prince Christian, and other dignitaries. And the newspapermen of the world descend on Copenhagen, all hoping to get an interview with Frederick Cook and jump on this enormous story. It really is the sort of story of the year. And it's just beginning. Hasn't even really started to heat up yet, which I'll get into. So Frederick Cook is being honored around Copenhagen. He's the guest of honor at all these fancy dinners, including this one. And in the middle of one of these dinners, someone comes in with a telegram, hands it to Frederick Cook at his table of honor. And Frederick Cook stands and reads this telegram. And on that telegram is a message from another polar explorer, Robert Peary. Stars and stripes nailed to the pole. So Robert Peary is now also claiming to have reached the North Pole. He's claiming to have reached it a year after Frederick Cook in 1909, whereas Cook was stuck up in the Arctic for a whole year. For a moment, for several days, there is a double celebration going on, especially in America, right? Because after all these decades of trying to get to the North Pole, we've not only sent one explorer there, we've sent two. We won first place and second place. So this is huge. Robert Peary, his story is told in the newspapers of the world, but especially in the New York Times. And here we have a sort of mirror image of the Herald aligning itself with Cook. The New York Times has paid in advance for exclusive rights to Peary's story, and honestly thinks he's going to be the first person with the pole, not the second. And so they've loaned him $4,000 to his expedition in exchange for exclusive rights to his story. So what's going to happen next is what really shocks everyone. Robert Peary accuses Frederick Cook of lying about getting to the North Pole. Says he has handed the public a gold brick, and he's basically a con man. And people can't believe that this is happening. This is the sort of honorable world of explorers where people are taking out their word and behave well, and you're going to create a huge scandal out of this. So what's going to happen is the New York Times is going to essentially back Robert Peary's version of this story, and the New York Herald is going to back Frederick Cook's version of the story. Because we have a highly partisan media debate around who got to the North Pole first. I will talk a little bit about Adolph Ochs, who is at this time the publisher of the New York Times. His acquisition of the New York Times is one of the amazing stories of entrepreneurial spirit, in my opinion. He came from very little, against all the odds, acquired this distinguished but basically bankrupt newspaper, the New York Times, and turns it around in really incredible fashion. And as some of you may know, it is still the descendants of Adolph Ochs who control the New York Times to this day, the Salzburgers. So he creates an incredible legacy, long-lasting legacy in a newspaper world. Really, he's the only one standing really from this period, unless I suppose you could also include Hearst. The Hearst Media Corporation is still around, but very few of these entities that are existing in this period I'm talking about are still with us today. The Times is one of them. So that's Ochs. James Gordon Bennett Jr. is the very colorful character behind the New York Herald, the newspaper supporting Frederick Cook. I will be honest, I had so much fun researching James Gordon Bennett Jr. He's one of the most outlandish, colorful, unpredictable characters you could hope for. Mostly forgotten today, but in his time, he loomed large as this sort of ridiculous, eccentric character. I mean, I think he makes Elon Musk look a little boring, to be honest. And the book gets into some of his escapades and larger-than-life persona. Just a little background on the Herald. James Gordon Bennett Jr. inherited the paper from his father, James Gordon Bennett Sr., who started the New York Herald way back in 1835. The New York Herald really was the first modern independent newspaper in the world, not just in America, but in the world. It did not ally itself with political parties or sort of financial investors in the way that other newspapers of the period did. It was very independent, and it was a populist voice, and it was very profitable. And James Gordon Bennett Jr. is taking over this profitable newspaper as a young man. Here he is in the 1860s during his brief and undistinguished Civil War service. He was really more interested in drinking and partying and racing yachts and racing fast horses than he was in military service or running the paper. A lot of people did not really expect him to do much with the New York Herald because he was such a kind of spoiled playboy. But very quickly into his takeover of his father's paper, he does something really incredible.
Weird because I was outside, so I'm
Oh, somebody needs to be muted. He does something really incredible that may ring a bell to some of you here. He sends a Herald correspondent named Henry Stanley into Central Africa to find Dr. David Livingstone. David Livingstone is the most famous explorer of the day, and he's gone missing. The American and British public are quite worried about where he is and who's going to rescue him. And, you know, in this period, you would normally have an organization like the Royal Geographical Society, or you'd have the British government going in search of him. But instead, it is an American newspaper run by James Gordon Bennett that sends its correspondent and, remarkably, manages to find Livingstone and really save his life. It's not an exaggeration to say the Herald does this. So this is an enormous news story. This is what the scoop of the decade looks like in the 1870s. It's not quite as splashy as today's New York Post, but this would have been considered huge news of the time. And one thing that it does is it establishes the New York Herald not only as the most influential newspaper in the United States, but the newspaper that is strongly associated with exploring and exploring almost investment ventures, right? Because Bennett has funded this expedition to find the lost explorer in hopes of recouping the costs and then some with a fantastic bombshell story. And that story succeeds tenfold. So Bennett tries to do that again with the North Pole expedition, led by this gentleman, George Washington DeLong. I'm going to skip that. This is a ship called the Jeannette, which goes to the Arctic in 1879. And long story short, that expedition completely bankrolled by the New York Herald. Again, this is kind of the equivalent of Fox News or CNN sending an expedition to the moon, to put it in some perspective. It's a lot of money. It's very risky. It's sort of cutting edge. And really, frankly, very few newspapers could afford to do it, apart from the Herald and a couple others. Unfortunately, this expedition to the North Pole fails. The ship gets stuck in ice, and a harrowing, awful sort of struggle for survival among the 30 or so members of that expedition. These are the surviving members. You can see there aren't that many. And that really turns the Herald away from polar exploring. It's taken a big loss on this one, and the Herald steps back. We have a shift, in a way, in polar exploring in the mid-1880s, partly because of that Herald expedition. And the thing about that Herald expedition was, yes, it was privately funded, but it was entirely staffed and in many ways managed by the US Navy. And it's considered a disaster. And this and a couple other examples, the result is the US government gets out of exploring. No longer is the taxpayer going to pay even a dime for these sort of risky ventures. It becomes a private enterprise with private fundraising. There's a sort of explorer who's been lost to history named Frederick Schwatka, who starts doing this very well. He's very entrepreneurial, and he's good at raising money and devising sort of dramatic expeditions that will get publicity. And another thing he's very good at is working with the newspapers. So we have the emergence here of a new type of media-savvy, self-promoting explorer who is not constrained by the sort of hierarchy or discipline of the government, of the armed services, but is really a privateer. So Frederick Schwatka, interesting character that has been mostly forgotten. One of the people who learns from Frederick Schwatka is one of the main characters in the story. That's Robert Peary. So Robert Peary is coming of age around the time Frederick Schwatka's career is ending. Robert Peary from my home state of Maine, Bowdoin College graduate. He becomes a Navy engineer and launches his own career into this more like privatized model. Yes, he's in the Navy, but he's constantly trying to secure leave to go do these adventures and build a reputation for himself as a private citizen, as an explorer, as America's greatest polar explorer, in fact, which is what he'll become. Here he is in Greenland in the 1890s. He does a remarkable thing on these early expeditions. He brings his wife, Josephine Peary, unheard of at this time for an Arctic explorer to bring his lady along. And that's what Peary does. And they even give birth to a child in northern Greenland within the Arctic Circle. It's the first time that's said to have happened. That's what that bundle is in that American flag. Josephine Peary is holding their baby, Marie, who was known popularly as the snow baby. That's what the Inuit called this white child. They'd never seen a white child before, the native people of this part of Greenland. And they came from miles around to see the so-called snow baby. And the snow baby was also a real phenomenon back home and added to the fame of the Pearys. And of course, now we know in this modern world that we live in, fame and publicity, these are good for fundraising and getting done the things you want to get done. So Robert Peary uses this model to go to the Arctic many times. He also has a really noteworthy companion, Matthew Henson. So this is a Black man in the 1890s, if you can believe it, going on these polar expeditions. Certainly the only Black man any within thousands of miles of this type of activity, and yet he's indispensable to Robert Peary. He's a really skilled driver of native sled dogs, and he learns the Inuit language better than Robert Peary ever does. And Matthew Henson is someone who's been kind of rediscovered in the last 30 or 40 years, and you have started to hear a little bit more about him. This is what these expeditions tend to look like. When I started writing this, I didn't fully understand the topography of these North Pole regions, but boy, they're climbing mountains really, because these pressure ridges, these giant plates of ice come together and form these enormous hummocks. And you can just start to get a sense of the backbreaking work, pushing these 1,000-pound sleds over jagged mountains of ice like this. This is what these guys are up against. This is why expensive expeditions have failed year after year after year. Not only do they have to get into the icy Arctic Ocean, but they had to do hundreds and hundreds of miles of this once they got there. Robert Peary would get a little closer to the pole in some of these expeditions before 1909. One thing he did, he discovered this incredible meteorite. And the thing about that meteorite, it sort of solved this mystery of why Inuit had metal. How did they get these harpoon tips and arrowheads? Robert Peary figured it out. And he also moved this 34-ton piece of meteorite back to New York City using those engineering skills he had, and ended up in the American Museum of Natural History. If anyone's been there or is planning to make a trip there, you'll find this 34-ton meteorite there today. Peary had the backing of some very wealthy and influential men. All these arch capitalists of the Gilded Age, they liked Peary. They wanted to bankroll him, and he would take whatever money they had. So this is Morris Jessup on the left, probably his biggest funder, co-founder and first president of the American Museum of Natural History. On the right, as you can probably tell, that's Theodore Roosevelt with a goodbye handshake to Robert Peary. Theodore Roosevelt really championed Peary as the symbol of American manhood and a sort of inspiration to all Americans. Just the amount of his courage, his toughness, his drive to claim the North Pole on behalf of America. This was a very sort of, I would say, jingoistic period in American history. We just won the Spanish-American War, about to flex our muscles on the world stage. And so President Roosevelt was really interested in this sort of international race to get to the North Pole, and he really wanted America to win that race. The biggest competitor Peary had at the time was Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian explorer. For my money, probably the best all-around explorer of this period, just a remarkable individual. But he was not as possessed with the idea of getting to the North Pole as Robert Peary was. He tried really once and then moved on to other things. Robert Peary, on the other hand, was completely obsessed with the idea of getting to the North Pole. Just a little detour here into the world of media again. Normally, when we talk about the newspaper world of the 1890s, we're hearing about these two guys. That's Joseph Pulitzer on the left, William Randolph Hearst on the right. These were the practitioners of so-called yellow journalism, which was this hugely powerful, popular press that was, sort of the, I guess you could call it cable news or almost like social media of its day. It often got the facts wrong, and it wasn't sort of respectable, but it had an enormous audience and really changed the way we think about the mass media. It really was the first mass media. And they have a role in this story, but it's really a story more of the so-called quality press to which the New York Times belonged and to which the Herald belonged. The Herald, again, run by this gentleman, James Gordon Bennett Jr., a very well-known public figure. This is the Herald building, which was in Herald Square, as you might have guessed, Midtown Manhattan. James Gordon Bennett's yacht. I do dwell a little bit in the book just because I think these things are so much fun. He had the most outlandish, expensive yacht on the ocean, basically. And there's a lot of fun stories associated with that. One other thing that was going on at this time was, people were trying different ways to get to the North Pole because so many other efforts had failed over the years. You had these sort of, I suppose you could say, more free-thinking entrepreneurs, and some of them were trying to get there by air as early as the 1890s. And this, of course, was a high period, high hopes for balloons and their abilities to go places. Unfortunately, every balloon expedition to the pole ended poorly. James Gordon Bennett Jr. in the Herald, I mentioned that Jeannette expedition that failed miserably, and it sort of dampened its enthusiasm for polar exploring. That said, the Herald did continue to be interested in it, and this particular balloon expedition, undertaken in 1897 by a Swedish explorer, Bennett offered $27,000 to have a Herald correspondent go along and have the exclusive story. The explorer turned him down. He didn't want to bring a journalist along. When he did that, he inadvertently saved a journalist's life, because this is how that expedition ended. The explorer Salomon Andre, his balloon crashed. Did not kill him and his companion outright, but they died. They died on the ice around Svalbard after that crash. So it's treacherous stuff. Many people died in the attempt to get to the North Pole. Just an image here of Robert Peary's expedition that would become so controversial and caught up with Frederick Cook in this great dispute. Robert Peary, on the right-hand side, you can see this ship. One of the great advantages Robert Peary had was this ship, which was the first purpose-built icebreaker in the Western Hemisphere. The Norwegians had made at least one previously. This was the first one in the Western Hemisphere, to the cost of $100,000, huge amount of money at the time, mostly paid for by Peary's wealthy industrialist friends and supporters. But that ship really gave him a big advantage because he could bust through the ice all the way up to the northern tip of Ellesmere Island and conserve resources, essentially food, his men's energy, his dog's energy, and start much closer to the pole. And Robert Peary insisted there's no way to get to the pole unless you do something like this. It has to be done this way. So when Frederick Cook returns, claiming to have gotten to the North Pole using very different methods, Robert Peary immediately doubts he is telling the truth, or even anywhere near the truth. But Frederick Cook and his many supporters are, of course, making the opposite argument. I absolutely did get there. So this argument, you would think the solution, and this is where it starts to resemble the sort of, I suppose, misinformation problems we have today. This is a dispute that really should be mediated by scientific authorities. It's difficult to prove you went to the North Pole. The North Pole is really a notional point. It's not a fixed point. It's on shifting plates of sea ice. So to prove you went there, you need a lot of scientific instruments, beginning with a sextant. You need carefully kept astronomical observations. You want a competent eyewitness. And presumably the thing that should happen when this argument sprouts up is that scientific authorities should look at all the proofs offered by both these explorers and render a disinterested, educated opinion. As so often happens, that is not what happened. It went immediately to the press, and it was sort of offered up to public opinion. We had a trial by media, and this battle for months at least was waged in the pages of the New York Times and the New York Herald and other newspapers. Here at the New York Times, the sort of dream team, you had Ox, the publisher, shown there on the left, an incredibly intelligent and perceptive managing editor in the middle, Carvan Anda, another figure who's been lost to history, but just had a sort of savant's brain. And the stories about his intelligence are too incredible to believe. He once was known to have corrected an error in one of Einstein's equations, for which Einstein later thanked him. And in the New York Times archives, there was a copy of the letter from Albert Einstein thanking the Times' editor for the correction. So Carvan Anda was a casual student of physics. He read Egyptian hieroglyphs. He had a sort of savant's memory for baseball stats. He was just a sort of incredible scientific mind. So this is the guy running the ship at the New York Times. And on the right, a figure who's important in a kind of different way. William Reich was an editor at the Times, but a sort of embittered former employee of the New York Herald. So when we talk about the New York Times kind of going to war with the New York Herald over this North Pole issue, they've got a very bloodthirsty executive in their corner as well. And I go into some of the backroom dealings between this editor, William Reich, and Robert Peary, and all sorts of things go on that totally violate the sort of journalistic ethics, certainly of today, if not also of the Times in that period itself. Fun story. So this is just a look at Frederick Cook. This is what an explorer actually looks like in the field, right? A lot of the pictures you find in archives are these carefully curated studio shots where their hair has been done up, and whether they're wearing their sort of polar furs or they're dressed up in their sort of, lecture table black tie, they're put together. This is the sort of oil-stained, matted hair look that these explorers actually had in the field. And of course, James Gordon Bennett Jr., just one more time, Frederick Cook's ally in this whole polar dispute. I'm not going to get into the dispute because that would be a spoiler for those of you who have not read the book, how it shakes up. But basically, suffice it to say that it's a very tricky thing to prove. Photographs claiming that he went to the North Pole did not really prove anything just because of the polar landscape. This is a photograph submitted by Frederick Cook, which he claimed to have taken at the North Pole with his 2 Inuit companions. There's my timer. Great. And these are photographs taken by Robert Peary, which you can find in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, claiming to have been taken at the North Pole. And these two would be questioned, not only at the time, but for decades. 1909, this dispute erupted. Several months later, it was settled to the satisfaction of many people. But over the decades, new facts would come to light and evidence of cover-ups would come to light. And this would not really be resolved to anyone's satisfaction for a long time. And some people would say it still hasn't been resolved. So I will just end by saying in 1988, the New York Times issued a correction. This is 1988, right? 80 years after the polar dispute, claiming that it had gotten some things wrong. And I studied the New York Times quite a bit for this book. I don't know of any other incident that led to a correction being printed in the paper 80 years after the fact. But that just shows you the extent to which the hunt for the truth was sort of drawn out, and just how wrong they got the story. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions that you have from reading the book or questions that this presentation may have gotten you to think of.
Okay, thank you so much. Now our moderator is Stan Roberts. You see the name Emily Berger?
Oh,
That's Stan Roberts, actually.
okay.
And so if you want to go ahead with some questions, I mean, we all have questions, but you go first then.
First of all, you're young and good looking. I never expected that. I was overwhelmed with the amount of the research, and I'm puzzled on how you could collect all the information, organize it, and get it in ready for you to actually sit down and start writing it. Is that a question that you could put together answer if we could put together for us?
Yes, I can certainly try. I mean, you're absolutely right. It was a huge amount of research. Look, I've been a full-time writer since 2007, but I'd never written a book before when I embarked on this in 2018, right? So I didn't have a sort of established system for collecting and organizing this volume of information. I had nowhere near a system for it. So it was tough. The truth is I acquired probably 30 books that I own and I had a bunch more than that in PDF form, right? So this is largely a digital database, I have to say. And honestly, I think it's a real godsend for researchers in my generation that so much has been digitized now. Especially those older books are now in the public domain. So things written in the 1920s and earlier are usually findable on a site like archive.org or a site like HathiTrust, HathiTrust.org. These are nonprofits that have digitized books in the public domain. And so that was hugely helpful. And the other hugely helpful thing about digital research is that you can do the find function. You're just looking for a word or a name. I mean, obviously, traditionally, we have an index in which you can look up names, but you can find any word if something has been properly digitized. So that helps me to find stuff, if not also to organize it. Otherwise, if I tried to give you a window into my research organizing, it would be, folders within folders within folders on my desktop or my Dropbox folder. Eventually, they got organized by chapter. This book has many chapters, I think like 52 chapters. And so there's sort of a chronological order to it. But that took me probably 2 years to get to, I had to really get familiar with stuff and also lay out the structure of the book before I could start organizing the research in a way that made sense. So it's a lot of brain space and it's very challenging. I hope to be doing it more efficiently for the next one. But yeah, when I go to the library, sometimes I will take notes on what I'm looking at. But another piece of technology, I don't have it on, another piece of technology that's really helpful these days is just your smartphone.
How did you when you sat down to write it, the two different stories, of course, the explorers and the newspapers. And I was so impressed with the way that you detailed both of them. So when you were sitting down to write it, did you have in your mind, I'm going to intertwine them? Can you give us a hint on that?
Yeah, sure. No, the structure of the book was a big part of the challenge, to be honest. Look, I found the subject. The reason I loved it was I'm interested in explorers. But when I found this media newspaper angle, it really felt like a story for me. I've been a reporter in New York City for a while. I've still not been to the North Pole, probably will never go. So I had to make these things work together. And I think they honestly do work together because the story of sponsorship and publicity is an angle that has not been looked at before, but it was very much there. So, if you've read the book, to me, it's really 60% ink, 40% ice, right? It's actually a little bit more about the press and how to spend time with both of those stories and get the maximum overlap is a structural challenge. You've got to do it structurally. And so I made the most of every time they properly overlapped. And I mean, the other structural point to make is about the time, right? Because I'll be honest, the first draft of this had a very convoluted structure where basically we were in 1909 when that controversy is happening, and then we're going back in time. And then we're jumping up to 1909 and a couple of things would happen in 2 weeks and then it'd go back again. And after writing that draft, this is a year or so of work, my editor and I looked at it and she's like, Darrell, I think you've got to scrap this structure, not the book. We've got, thank God, but we've got to scrap the structure and make it different. So what you're seeing is attempt number 2 with a more straightforward structure than the first one, a little more chronological rather than hopscotching back and forth. Over, did you have a question?
Let me ask a question.
Yeah.
If you were a journalist, this is a hypothetical question. If you were a journalist in those days, and you have Joseph Pulitzer, Adolph Ox, Reynold Hearst, and Mr. George Bennett, whom would you like to work for?
That's a great question. I think it's funny because I think, believe it or not, the journalists themselves really seem to like working for Hearst.
Hearst.
Yes. And that may be a surprising thing to hear, but at least in this period, Hearst was the youngest of those guys and very energetic. He almost had this kind of Boy Scout quality. and he was loaded with money, and he paid people very well. He was really, according to the memoirs by journalists of the period, he was the most fun to work for. I think Ox would be a very close second. And the reason for that is Ox was a very respectful, cordial, nice boss. He actually really struggled to fire people. And the thing that Ox did very well was imbue his employees with a real sense of respect for the institution of the New York Times. So you had at these other papers people who found it exciting to work there, stressful, well paid, whatever, but they didn't develop the sort of deep loyalty, the deep lifelong loyalty that employees of the New York Times had. And in fact, this is something you still hear today from people who work at the New York Times. I have a few friends who do it. You really are kind of there for life. They make it very hard to leave. There's an editor back in the day, at the time I'm writing about, who said it was sort of generally understood at the New York Times that the only decent way to leave the Times was to have a New York Times funeral. Any other way of leaving was considered crazy. Why would you ever do that? So Hearst and Ox. And then Bennett, James Gordon Bennett was an absolute insane nightmare to work for. He fired people all the time, often for the wrong reason, and he got their name wrong, and he fired someone he intended to fire the other person. Just a comedy of ridiculous errors. But on the other hand, for Bennett, the Herald, especially earlier in his career, was a ticket to adventure in a way that no other newspaper was. He was sending these correspondents galloping around the world on wild sort of goose chases and all kinds of fun stuff. Henry Stanley being only one example of that. Stanley, if he was on assignment to find Livingston, but if he didn't find Livingston, his assignment was to go to Tibet and find the Dalai Lama. Just these incredible adventures that no other newspaper was really sending correspondence on. So that was the sort of good/bad proposition of working for the Herald. And the thing I'd say about Pulitzer was generally agreed to be the hardest driving, the worst boss of all of them. We remember him today as sort of a great crusader, which he was. He was a genius of the newspaper trade, a real spearhead for progressive causes. But Pulitzer was an absolute nightmare to work for, according to basically everyone who worked for him.
More questions from the audience here.
Who do we have?
Question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You showed a picture of that meteorite, 34,000 pounds or tons. I'm not sure what you said. How did that thing get from where it was located down to New York City?
Yeah, 34 tons. I couldn't tell you step by step how it got there, but essentially Robert Peary, being an engineer, he devised this sort of ingenious system of rails using wooden beams to roll it and sort of draw it using ropes down onto the ship he had there, secured it within the ship. Beyond that, there are photos of it traveling through the streets of New York City, I think on sort of a roller rail setup. So they put these logs next to each other and sort of just rolled or pulled that meteorite through the streets until it got into the museum. But I can't give you more details than that. But truly a feat of only an engineer can pull off, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Would you have another book in the works, Darrell?
I'm trying to find a subject that I can write about. I haven't found it yet. I'll spend a few months looking at different subjects. It's a matter of, is it interesting enough? Is there enough information out there? Has it been a while? Can I put a new spin on it? And I haven't found the right thing yet. So if anyone in this group has sort of a secret archive about an incredible story that hasn't been told, please send it my way. It's tricky because a lot of books are published, and you want to find something that hasn't been written about yet. Whether it's a topic or just a fresh angle, and you sink a lot of time into finding the thing that's going to be just right, that's the phase I'm in right now.
I noticed you mentioned your editor with this book. Was he an editor that worked for the publisher, or someone that worked with you to help you with the book?
Now this is an editor at Viking,
Yeah,
and she's a very experienced editor, has a lot of great authors under her belt. Honestly, it was an honor to work for her. She publishes Nathaniel Philbrick, who did In the Heart of the Sea. That's an author of
yeah.
hers. She won a Pulitzer last year because she was behind that big biography of J. Edgar Hoover that came out. So she does big books, and I was really flattered to work with her and also just be the beneficiary of her editing skills, and to watch someone that good at their job, and to, again, benefit from them carefully reading every sentence you've done and giving you so many good suggestions. It was really a treat to be able to do that. Unfortunately, she's no longer, she's taken retirement. So I was hoping to do a second book with her, but it doesn't look like that's going to be possible.
Rick, go ahead.
Darrell,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In reading the book, I had the sense that you didn't feel like that the Times was the only paper really interested in the truth, and the others were more interested in the story.
Yeah.
Did I misread you or
I think,
your feeling?
yeah. No, that's, if you really want to boil it down, I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. For me, I did want to tease out a little bit more nuance than that, but that's true. I think the Times was always a dry newspaper, and it was not interested in colorful coverage or entertaining readers, and many of the other newspapers were. And in fact, some of the newspapers that had formerly been kind of more boring and respectable were veering into this sensationalistic territory, right? And the Times was the one that really held the line. And the Times also, it really cherished this idea of impartiality. In my opinion, it didn't always live up to that ideal, but certainly trying to achieve that ideal was central to the way the newspaper operated. And I think the Times, it did a pretty good job. This is a huge discussion. I wrote an essay about this whole thing and this idea of journalistic objectivity and what the New York Times of this period was doing in terms of journalistic objectivity. I wrote that for The Atlantic back when the book came out. And my thesis is that, journalistic objectivity, that was not a term that was around at this time. That became a term in the 1920s, the scientific ideal of objectivity being applied to the newspaper trade, being applied to media. But the Times was attempting to do an early version of that, partly because, I would say, because of that editor I mentioned, Carl Van Ander, who really was a scientific mind. And I think he believed the newspaper could achieve this sort of almost scientific level of impartiality or objectivity. The interesting thing I'll say is to see what happens to that value system when the paper is under strain or under pressure, right? So during this North Pole controversy, the Times was very much under pressure and in the middle of this fist fight, basically, with the Herald. And in my opinion, it did stray away from its values of impartiality quite significantly. Not because of what it did to Cook. I think it was taking a very hard, critical eye at Frederick Cook's claim to have gotten to the North Pole, right? Totally in keeping with the Times's values. But what it did not do is give that same scrutiny to Robert Peary. It's because
until the very end of the book.
Yes, till 1988.
Right. But the other question is, do you think your impression of both Peary and Cook, did they really believe that they had found the North Pole, or do you think Cook was, I don't want to say a con man, but do you think Cook was profiteering on the idea that he almost got there and said he did?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe Cook truly thought he had reached the North Pole. But I think Frederick Cook had a very strange mind that was capable of convincing him and other people of complicated things. So I think actually Frederick Cook is a real enigma, and we'll never really know everything that was going on with him. On the other hand, I think Robert Peary's, he was a tortured guy with this whole did he get there or did he not? But I think it's a simpler explanation. I hesitate to explain it because I think it'll spoil things. But I think Robert Peary The thing to know about Robert Peary, I don't think he was that complicated. I think he was hugely competitive. He had an almost sociopathic competitive instinct, and that led him into these extreme statements and attacks that he got into in 1909, and got him, and ultimately got him in some trouble.
Let's see if we have any more questions from the audience here.
I've got a suggestion on a book. I'd love to see a good biography on Al Smith, the governor of New York in the 20s.
Interesting.
And make sure you call Robert Caro up before he dies, because he's got a lot of research on it. And Caro, by the way, has said his biggest regret is that he won't be able to live to write a biography on Al Smith.
On Al Smith. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think the last thing Kara needs is a distracting call for me. That's an interesting thing to think about. I have actually, the topic I'm currently looking into after 3 or 4 where I've paused is from the 30s, sort of a 30s and 40s tale of the sort of gangster syndicate that was known as Murder Inc. So this is Jewish and Italian gangsters. And that story's been told a couple times, but I don't think anyone's really done, at least not in the last 50 years, a serious sort of thorough, but also thrilling account of that. And especially from the courtroom perspective. I think it's not just the gangland murders and the sort of awful racketeering stuff that was that interesting about that story. It's the actual courtroom scenes are really something. And so if you're into legal thrillers, which I kind of am, I think there might be something there. And that's what really gets me excited, right? I like research. I love learning about the themes that these historical books can tease out and what they can teach us about, the country we live in, or the way some of these social systems work, whatever they have to teach us. But I also really like that challenge of creating characters and scenes that feel like they're out of a novel or out of a movie, with that sort of constraint of fact. You have to stick to the facts. That's the nice challenge for me.
One last question on
You got
the.
a question there. Go ahead, Ed.
Oh,
Ed Corey, you were raising.
okay. Hi, yeah. Hi, Darrell. I really enjoyed the book, and I really didn't know much about the North Pole race, if you will. But what I particularly enjoyed, I didn't know anything really about Bennett, and you portrayed such a colorful figure, and juxtapose him, with Ox. Of course, if Ox had tried to do that today, he would have been probably sued for fraud, because he wasn't really upfront about what he had. But no, I enjoyed the book. My father was was a journalist. He was United Presser. Knew Cronkite and Eric Severide and Howard K. Smith and all those guys. And worked for one of the more odious characters in newspaper or media history, Hugh Bailey, who ran United Press and was one of the biggest cheapskates on the planet, except for when it came to his own expense. But I mean, the Times evolution, and one could make arguments about where it has gone and where it's been, not really living up to the standards that it set out, especially in the late 70s and 80s, when the dynamics between journalists and managers was completely thrown out of kilter. So they couldn't control people like Cy Hirsch. Anyway, I really enjoyed the book and enjoyed looking at the photographs that you brought in. And I do have a suggestion, which maybe I can get your email from Ovid and send it to you.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, just on the Times, it definitely, and I learned, the Times has become a very different paper, not just, nowadays it's got its own culture wars going on inside. It's also sort of issue, I think, of management in conflict, not really with the journalists so much. I think the Times has gotten so digital that there's a sort of culture of the people who come in from the tech world, and they're not gelling with these sort of journalistic values that the Times has. And so I think actually that's the source of the latest conflicts you're reading about in the press. If you're following any of these stories about Times staffers protesting and resigning and getting fired over really political issues. The Times of this period, 1909, the turn of the century, is a conservative paper. That's what I was interested to learn so much about. This is not the Times of the Pentagon Papers at all, and even by and part of that is down to Ox as an individual. And I like this way that the characters of these newspaper publishers really infuse the paper that they run. Ox was conservative. He didn't want to ruffle feathers. He really wanted the Times then to be sort of the official voice of the American officialdom, I guess you could call it, the establishment. And so he was really about preserving the status quo in a lot of ways. And the Times today has some of that. It is definitely establishment, and it may be perhaps a different way. It's much less pro-Wall Street than the Times of the early 20th century. So it's just interesting to see the way the Times has stuck to its essence, if you will, over the years in some ways, and has changed with the times or new generations in other ways. But at the end of the day, I think you have to say it's an extraordinary institution, and especially extraordinary if you're a historical researcher, because they take their archives very seriously. The Times Digital Archive, which any subscriber has access to, is just a wonder of it's comprehensive, it's easy to navigate, everything is in there. The paper really does see itself as this historical record in a way that other newspapers have not. So if you're coming from my point of view, a supremely useful resource.
Darrell,
Mhm.
one other question about the book with Perry and thinking he reached the North Pole. You mentioned at the very beginning that with the shifting of the ice, I mean, what if you put a flag where the ice North Pole actually was one year in 2008, and if you went back in 2015, how far is it possible that had shifted away? I mean, are we talking hundreds of yards, or are we talking miles? And
Oh, dozens, if not hundreds of miles. These gyrating currents are
that's what I thought.
huge and sweeping. I mean, that flag would float away when you woke up the next morning, probably.
Yeah, so it'd be easy for him to think, or when somebody went back up to look, they wouldn't find any physical evidence that he had been at what he thought was really the North Pole.
Absolutely. And that's the whole root of the problem here, right? When you're trying to prove it, it's not like the South Pole. If you know the story of the South Pole, Robert Falcon Scott arrived at the South Pole hoping to be the first person to get there. And what does he see? He sees tents and flags and other stuff that's been left behind a few weeks earlier by Roald Amundsen. So there's no doubt that Amundsen got there. If the stuff is there, he even left him a note to really drive the knife home. So that's the South Pole, which is on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is on terra firma. The North Pole is completely on floating pieces of ice. And it's funny because at the time, they would use these expressions. Peary said, I planted the flag on the pole. Frederick Cook claimed to have left sort of canister with a balled up flag there. And the press loved hearing this. It was such a symbolic gesture, such a powerful thing, this idea of leaving a flag at the pole. But of course, it meant nothing. It would not be there for anyone to find. It would not be there as evidence that you made it. It was purely a symbolic gesture. It kind of reflects on this whole North Pole race to begin with. Very symbolic, and this was an issue at the time. People were asking, why are we spending so much effort and money to get to the North Pole? What are we going to find there? The answer is nothing. You're going to find nothing. But it doesn't mean there's no reason to do it, right? So that's the big question.
Is there a recognized leader or a recognized explorer by the National Geographic that is recognized as the finder of the North Pole?
Well, the thing I would say to that is National Geographic Society is not the one to rely on with these polar issues. In the book, again, this I'm not necessarily saying this is the case with Nat Geo today, but in the early 20th century, they basically got it wrong multiple times and were very bad judges of some of these claims to the North Pole. I would say, so when we talk about who got to the North Pole first, who the experts sort of believe deserves the credit for having done that, it's really the first three folks who claim to have got there all knowingly lied, in my opinion. And the first properly documented trip to the North Pole then has to be credited to Roald Amundsen going there in an airship, because unlike his predecessors, he presented indisputable proof that he reached 90 degrees north. He had witnesses, he had documentation, he even had kind of live real-time confirmation using the sort of early radio technology of the period. So I would say the experts who are unbiased and don't really have a horse in this race basically agree that the credit should go to Roald Amundsen, which makes him the discoverer, if you really want to be real about it, the discoverer of the South Pole and the North Pole, using two very different methods. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're about ready to close. Maybe one more question, either Richard, Dave, or Mark Cooper. Any of you interested in a question there?
I am.
Richard.
I am.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
I do.
We're ready. Go for it.
You listening? Oh, you're mute. You're on mute. Okay. Unmute, please.
Yeah, I heard him, and then I didn't hear him.
Go ahead, Richard. Rick?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
You know, the early 20th century or late 19th was not exactly a dead area in history of science. So my question is, why was there such a fanaticism to go to the North Pole? It's not a huge scientific exercise. What was there to prompt people to go there rather than to real investigation such as Africa?
Right. Yeah, a good question. You know, the way I say it in the book is the race to the North Pole is really an international competition. It was basically like an endurance sport. And you're right. I think most scientific authorities who knew anything about it, they knew enough to surmise that we would not really discover anything there. So why are we going? And it's, you know, at this time, Africa had been explored. You know, the last great mystery of Africa, what is the source of the Nile, that had been figured out. So the geographical sort of mysteries of the rest of the planet were considered solved. And that left really, you know, they hadn't fully gotten into mountains yet, right? Everest would come later. Those Himalayan peaks had not been summited. But in terms of unvisited parts of the planet, all that really remained was the North Pole and the South Pole. And these were thought to have been discovered within 2 years of each other, right? We had the North Pole and the South Pole. So a lot of energy was going to those two. And in addition to that, I would say in America especially, there was a lot of interest in getting there, just really out of sort of patriotic spirit. It would be the generous way of putting it. The sort of jingoistic bragging rights would be another way of putting it. And as I alluded to earlier, you know, that era of Theodore Roosevelt was really pivotal for the history of America, because we won the Spanish-American War. We started to occupy places like the Philippines and Cuba, and America really became this international player in a way it had not been before. And some would say a sort of imperial power. So we're joining this international sort of grabbing contest for things like the North Pole. America really wanted to flex its muscles. I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt. He championed this polar exploring more than previous presidents. And I think it was because he wanted America to prove itself to be the greatest country on earth in a new way. I think he really supported these sort of, Theodore Roosevelt championed, he had this famous expression, the strenuous life. He really had this sort of cause of challenging yourself, of athletics, of displays of courage. So he was the perfect president and the perfect sort of cultural moment to encourage this type of manly endeavor that doesn't necessarily have real purpose except to demonstrate the awesomeness of manly endeavors. And from the American perspective, I really do think that's what it was about, especially when you compare the American version of this polar exploring with, say, the Norwegian version. And if you look at the way the Norwegians were doing it, they did have an interest in getting to the North Pole, but it was far less important to them than other elements of Arctic exploring and Arctic living. They were doing a lot of mapping. They were doing a lot of scientific studies. They were wintering year after year. They were comfortable spending multiple winters in the Arctic and just sort of getting comfortable there and interacting with the environment. And the Americans, and in particular Robert Peary, was a very driven, single-minded type of guy. He just wanted to get there, get the trophy, and get out. So you had a combination of this individual's personality and a sort of national mood or national sentiment, I would say, that, results in this interest in getting to the pole. If I'm honest about it, Robert Peary, he was the most famous American explorer. People were kind of overjoyed when he got to the pole and sort of won the glory for it. But not everyone loved Robert Peary. He wasn't that likable a guy. And some of his books, his earlier books, didn't really sell that well. And when he started attacking Cook, he was one of the most unpopular people in America because people just thought he was mean. So he didn't always endear himself to the public, even though people like Theodore Roosevelt were giant supporters of his.
Okay, Stan, we can be closing here with Darrell. Stan?
Yes.
So we can close with Stan.
Yeah. Darrell, are you still with us?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation. It's a terrific book, and we wish you a lot of good luck. And we look forward to you producing another book so we can have another book club analysis of it and invite you to share it with us.
Well,
good luck and thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun. I'd love to do it again. Wish me luck.
Okay. Bye
Thank
now.
you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
All right. Well, Stan is all yours now.
Okay. Thank you. That was terrific.
No, he was.
But thank you. This was so special. You getting a chance to talk to an author and get the inside of what went into producing this book. 4 years, and wonderful research. Anyway, I think it seems that everyone so far liked the book. I'd like to go around the room though and see whether your overall take on it and any minuses that you spotted or things that could have been handled differently. So Ovid, can you steer us around? You start with Dick.
I would say
Dick Saunders.
I have several comments, but some people haven't spoken at all. Mark Cooper.
Yeah, Mark.
And Dave, they haven't had a chance. Yeah.
I liked the book. I thought that from my personal preference, I was sleeping through the discovery of the North Pole. I didn't find that particularly interesting. I know it was critical to the approach that was being taken. On the other hand, I thought I found the history of the newspapers. I found that fascinating. So I liked the book, but from my perspective, I would have rather just seen a book about the history of the newspapers. But that's just my individual prejudice. I thought it was very well written. I thought it was very interesting. It was just there was a lot of science there that I didn't follow, and I wasn't really that interested in. But I enjoyed the book.
Okay. Dick Saunders?
I enjoyed the book, but I was tempted to ask what artificial intelligence would have done with the subject.
Well,
Dick,
might
you
have been
can
a
always-
different book.
but
Dick, you can ask that question of artificial intelligence.
No,
Just ask Jack.
I really can't, but I had an experience with writing a little bit, and it was presented by my mentor for an AI rendition, and the rendition was a hell of a lot better than mine.
I don't believe that.
happened. But
Al, we didn't hear. Al?
Yes,
Yeah.
in contrast to what Mark just said, I did not like the first part of the book about the ink part of it. I like the ice part about it, the explorers and the challenges that they faced. I would have hated to have been on that exploration or any of the explorations and have to deal with that cold weather.
Okay.
I think he would have written I would say, a book only about the newspaper, only about the explorers. Perhaps it wouldn't be as interesting. He intertwined the two, which looked to me a little strange, but he was able to, that's quite an accomplishment, to intertwine these two stories somehow, how the newspaper were sponsoring, financing, and trying to create news. And in that sense, I found the book interesting. Now, the last two chapters, when they talk about all these, the latitudes they reach and a lot of geographic technicalities, I found it a little bit slow at the end. Perhaps that could have been summarized. But overall, the creation of the newspaper, my question to him was, you like to work for Hearst or Pulitzer? Or,
Yeah.
I got an interesting answer. He said Hearst. And Hearst,
Yeah.
was notorious about promoting the war in Cuba and a few other things. Find me the news, I'll find you the war. He said to one of his reporters. Yeah. But
Ed? Where's Ed?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. What's your overall
Yeah,
take on
I
the
mean,
book?
I like the book. It reminded me of I think this group read Eric Larson's Thunderstruck, Marconi, and the
Yeah.
sensational Crippen
Yeah.
murder, I think it was. Any case, which I don't want to be too critical, but I thought that the interweaving by Eric Larson was done with a little bit more finesse. But I like the book. I really didn't know, and I didn't care that much about the race to the North Pole. And I certainly thought he, uh, presented evidence that while Perry may not have reached it, the competitor, um, really, took, was a con man. I mean, the climb up, was it McKinley Mountain? Was a fraud. And I came away with the impression that, that Perry may not have made it, but while not being a very nice person, was more honorable. Anyway, yeah, I mean, now I know more about that than I had read about the origins of the New York Times. I had almost no knowledge about Bennett, who I thought was, a really colorful character. There was something, I don't know what the most appropriate adjective would be, but rascalian, a rascal. Anyway.
Yeah. Dick Weiner.
Well,
Where are you?
I'm right here.
Okay.
Am I, is sound on?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I really, I started off maybe a little bit slow, but then I really liked the book. And as the more I thought about it and even listening to him a little bit more, but at first it was strange that you would have two areas that at first seemed to be so far apart, but I think later it made a point to me, and I found both of them very interesting as it was, but I think it made a point that the newspaper would do things to generate their own news. If there wasn't enough news around, what was one of the letters dealing with a war? You know, one of them was willing to help start a war, I think, to get some more.
Yeah, William Randolph Hearst.
But so here they are, they're developing their own story, and they even invested a little extra money so they would have the rights to be the original publisher of the letters. And so I then saw the tie-in as a lot more, and you wonder, how much more did the newspapers do to generate their news at that time? But I'm glad whoever brought the book to our attention did, and I learned a whole lot more about both the early ages of the newspaper industry and the explorers. I don't know if it was Al that just said, I can't even imagine trying to do what those explorers did. I mean, that's just incredible. But
Okay.
thanks
You mentioned about William Randolph Hearst with his famous quote to the journalist in Cuba: "You furnish the photographs, I'll provide the war." Does anybody can anybody cite an example of a newspaper doing that in more modern times? Really? Can anyone think of an incident?
I'm sure there are those newspapers you buy at when you go to Publix, you buy the cashier, there are all these big news, which one of the points is the origins of yellow journalism, creating all type of fake, sensationalistic, bombastic news. And do we have any papers like that? I imagine we do, to some extent.
Anybody remember one?
Dan, would just the idea of the papers having investigative reporters who go in to look at the politicians, look at different ventures that get started, and look for what's maybe behind the story. They're helping to create, and in a very positive way, as far as I'm concerned, developing the news by using investigative reporters, not just reporters that are writing on what has just happened and making current news. So I don't know if that's not like fabricating news, but that's helping, doing more than sitting back and just letting the news come to you.
Well, there's one particular thing that I'm referring to with the New York Times. Does anybody remember an instance with them in very modern times?
What's
All right.
the paper?
I think I've stumped everybody.
Would the Pentagon Papers fall into that, or?
Well, no, because that was authentic information that
you're talking about that they.
I'm talking about the newspaper using something that's not 100% legitimate.
How about the laptop?
The what?
Laptop.
A laptop. Biden's laptop.
I'm not, you lost me.
Biden's son's laptop.
Hunter Biden's laptop.
Oh, was the Times covering that?
No, they decried it. They said it was all fake.
Okay. I'm talking about a story that, well, let me tell you what I'm talking about. In 2000, the Times reporter Judith Miller did a series of articles about weapons of mass destruction. And her source for that was Scooter Libby, who was the chief of staff for Vice President Cheney. And the Times ran word for word every one of her stories and did not check a single one. And we later learned that there was no weapons of mass destruction. This was in the year 2000. And of course, Judith Miller was fired, even though, she only reported what was told, but she didn't check it. And Libby, of course, was, let me think, Libby was charged with he was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice. And President Bush commuted his sentence and then granted clemency, but he never gave him a full pardon. So that's it. And when I was reading the thing with William Randolph Hearst, I was thinking about the times. Anyway, back to the book. The
That's
he had a
wait a minute. Wait a minute.
yes, yes, Mark.
If I may interrupt.
Sure.
There's a difference between, it seems to me, there's a difference between just believing what a government affiliated a witness tells you, and so they accurately reported what he said, whereas what Hearst did was he made up a story out of whole cloth.
That's true.
I would think those are different
Well,
things.
yeah. Well, actually, you're right. You're right. Now that I think about it.
Yeah, it's a
It's a good
difference
point.
without a distinction. I mean,
Right,
or
it could
distinction
be.
without a difference. I mean, I would like to bring up the case, which is somewhat personal, but the New York Times, and the only time in its history, and you can double check this, wrote a front page, 2,300 word retraction 8 years after the fact. The front page, okay, written by Cy Hirsch, because he and others had maligned my father and his role in Chile. And you can look it up, read front page 2,300 word retraction, and you'll see it right there. But it was 8 years after the fact.
Okay. All right. Let's get back here.
Well, I'm just
Excuse
pointing
me,
out
Yeah, I
that
appreciate that.
I've got
Do you guys
I've
think
got to go.
that
So I'm
that the paper handled the newspapers? What about their coverage of the Cook and Perry explorations, and the fact that they had paid for some of the costs of some of the explorations?
That was $4,000, and it was
Yeah.
sort of a loan, or rather, it was a loan with so many ties attached that anyway, if the story was not interesting, then he would have to return the money or something like that. Remember in the book?
Yeah.
Yep.
The New York Times was accused of all kind of things, a leonine contract, given $4,000 with so many conditions for this guy to go to North Pole. So basically, they were just trying to create news for the purpose of selling the newspaper. The other thing is, we didn't talk about it, when the newspaper, the cost of the sale to the public was 1 cent. In order to make more money, they reduced the price of the newspaper. And they were making enough money on advertising, and it worked quite well for the New York Times. And there were a lot of interesting topics about all this monopoly on the telecommunication systems, that this guy, Jay Gould, had complete control of the transatlantic cable, and how the others got together and lowered the price of the telecommunications. He didn't say about the explorers. Apparently, if you go today to the Eskimos and do a DNA test, you will find some, Eskimos with blue eyes and all that kind of things. Apparently, they have some relation with the Eskimo woman, these explorers. That was an interesting topic here. And there is a group, an association of descendants of the explorers nowadays among the Eskimos.
Anybody have any thoughts about the title of the book? It's kind of interesting, a surprising title. Ed, what do you think? Dick?
I wasn't moved or turned off by it. It was the subject. I wasn't terribly interested in polar science, but I found the paper history very fascinating.
So Um, oh, sorry guys, we had a cake at home. It was
Yeah.
so so it will have to be some other time.
Well, the important thing, do we get a rain check on the apricot pie?
Yeah, but
Oh, but thank you so much for arranging the interview with Darrell. I mean, I found that absolutely incredible. I was very impressed with him and he was very forthcoming. I like the fact that he went and said that the first draft of the book the editor had to really work it over, and it was nice of him to be that confident, and he praised the editor, who I was curious who the editor was, and it was from Viking Press. I was very impressed with him all the way around, and I look forward to him, coming up with another book. Anybody have any other thoughts that I didn't bring up that you want to?
Somebody said, where are the editors when we need them? But at least it's always room for editors, but not all the books are, I would say, edited in a way that make it really readable. But I think, other than the last chapter or two, I found a little slow about interaction, the lives of the different characters there.
Yeah, I thought he did a marvelous job of profiling the editors, and especially Beckman and Hearst.
And you mean
And I was like Mark. I found some of the exploration stuff over my head and a bit boring, and I kind of phased over it. But overall, I thought it was a very well done, certainly well researched, and very well written, and covered two very interesting topics.
this guy is the first book for him.
Yes.
It's article for different newspapers and magazines.
Yeah. He said he worked for 7 years as a freelance writer. The one question I didn't ask him was, how the hell you make a living as a freelance writer?
Wealthy wife.
Talking about making a living, when I corresponded with him, I said, would you like to do a little talk for us, And he responded, well, very apologetic. He said, I make my money by writing.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I beg all this and that, it will be $100 charge for this, So, okay, well, he was almost apologetic because he was going to charge for this.
Yeah.
Said, well, it's going to be 50 a minute. He spoke actually for a little over an hour.
Yeah. He seemed to enjoy it.
Yeah, he speaks well.
He did.
Yeah. So we'll see. I'll let you know the date of. But anyway, anything else, Stan?
No, thanks so much for arranging the interview. That was very, very special.
Okay. And so we'll let you know about the December meeting. And,
okay.
Talk from there. Okay.
Good night.
Thank you again.
Good night.
Good night.
Everybody.
And I thank you, Evan.
Sure.
Thank you.